Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Open Minds podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Balkaran. And again, many of you have asked me to continue to explore Russia and Ukraine, and specifically Ukraine. And I have with me Dr. Ivan Katchanovski. Professor, one thing that I'm really interested in your research is you talk a lot about the divisions in Ukraine on regional and linguistic lines. For many in the West, we're just so unfamiliar with that. We treat and there's a narrative of Ukraine as this singular block. Why is it so important we discuss the regional and linguistic lines within Ukraine to help frame the issue of Russia and Ukraine?
I think this is a very crucial issue, which is almost never reported by the media. Or if they report, they deny this and claim this is like kind of disinformation and so on. And I did dissertation on this topic under the direction of Simon Martin Lipset, who was actually founder of Canadian Studies and one of the most cited political scientists in history. And I later published this as a book. And in my research, I also did subsequent examination of regional divisions, and I can say that Ukraine was one of the most regionally divided countries in the world before actually this conflict started in 2014. And for this reason, this is another reason why I regarded possibility of violent conflict very significant in Ukraine. And I mentioned this in my dissertation, comparing Ukraine to neighboring Moldova, which had basically civil war and Russian with support of Russian military for separatists in the Transnistria region of Moldova. And I examined why in Ukraine there were no such violent conflict compared to Moldova, why there was no war or civil war and Russian military involvement in such a conflict. And at the time, my findings was that this was due not to kind of divisions which were very significant and similar to Moldova and much more significant compared to Canada and many other countries which have regional divisions or cleavages. But in terms of Ukraine, this was also very important because eastern part of Ukraine, specifically Donbas, and southern part of Ukraine, in particular Crimea, were very different politically in terms of their orientation. They were oriented more towards Russia and supported pro-Russian candidates and political parties in Ukraine since independence of Ukraine in 1991, while Western Ukraine and to a lesser extent Central Ukraine were pro-Western in terms of orientation, and they supported like pro-nationalist parties and politicians, and also pro-Western parties and politicians. But this pro-Russian orientation does not mean that all people in Eastern and Southern Ukraine wanted to join Russia. As, this was in terms of support for separatism. There were two regions which I identified in my book, based on my dissertation, which showed such strong support for separatism, for Russian separatism. And one region was Crimea, another region was Donbas. And to a lesser extent, there were like some significant separatist support in Kharkiv and Odessa, but it was minority compared to these two regions in which you have majority support for separatism. And this is what I wrote in my dissertation, in my book, and this is why I think it was a very crucial issue to understand these divisions. And there is also linguistic division, which is goes back to language because Russian is main language even for many ethnic Ukrainians who speak Russian as their native language in eastern and southern Ukraine, while Ukrainian is dominant language in western Ukraine and it's majority language in central Ukraine, but including now Kiev. But it was not always the case in Kiev, specifically during the Soviet times when I was a student there. But if you look into reasons for this is going back to history, because Western Ukraine used to be part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also some regions were part of Poland before World War II, and you have regions which were part of Czechoslovakia before World War II, and also one region was part of Romania. And this is very different from Eastern and southern Ukraine, which is linked historically to Russia. And Russia claims this is Novorossiya, that they are basically ethnic Russians, or they are Russians, but they are actually populated, most of people there, with the exception of Crimea and Donbas, are ethnically Ukrainian, even so they speak Russian as their main language. And in terms of historical divisions, regional divisions are very important. and they also often coincide with linguistic divisions, but linguistic divisions is not main factor. You have more historical divisions. As I mentioned, separatism now became much more important issue for division in Ukraine since specifically 2014, when Donbas became its autonomy from Ukraine, and now there was a civil war between pro-Russian separatists in Donbas and Ukrainian central government. And in Crimea, there was a secession, basically, or annexation of this Crimea with help of Russian military intervention. But there was also very strong support for joining Russia in Crimea, because this is a region of Ukraine which is populated by mostly ethnic Russians.
Professor, thank you for sharing your personal background as well, being Ukrainian. A question for you as you were speaking. You mentioned Donbas and Crimea have very pro-Russian sentiment, the majority there. If the war started and the Ukrainian government at the time said, I recognize that eastern parts of our country, Donbas and Crimea, are very pro-Russian, we're willing to cede that territory so long as there's an agreement that the remaining territory of Ukraine remain intact, would this war have been prolonged? I know it's a hypothetical, but I just often wonder that because there seems to be very strong pro-Russian sentiment in eastern parts of Ukraine.
As mentioned, this Russian orientation in eastern Ukraine was different in different regions, because Russian orientation, for instance, in Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk region of eastern Ukraine was, and the Zaporizhia region of eastern Ukraine was basically supporting closer relations with Russia, like a customs union, and also use of Russian as a second language for Ukraine, and they opposed NATO membership of Ukraine. But in terms of their orientation, they do not support joining Russia. The attached to Donbas region, which is also in eastern Ukraine, but in Donbas region, according to public opinion poll, which I commissioned in spring of 2014, majority of respondents supported various forms of separatism, including autonomy within Ukraine, but also a very significant number supported joining Russia, and this significantly increased afterwards. So in Crimea, there was also majority support for joining Russia, specifically after 2014. It was less than majority before the Maidan started in 2014, but this changed since at the time of Maidan there was a relatively pro-Russian government of Yanukovych in power, so the support for separatism obviously was lower at the time, and it significantly increased after overthrow of Yanukovych by means of the Maidan Massacre in these regions, because they were a basis of support for Yanukovych, and many people started to support separation from Ukraine in Crimea and Donbas. So this is kind of such again situation in Ukraine, which is often not reported by the media, and they basically represent Ukraine, which I do not recognize from my own personal experience and from my own research. So I call this like fairy tale or Hollywood version of Ukraine, which is just is not a real Ukraine.
Professor, why is it that there is a narrative that is being told about this conflict? I find that when I read your research, I'm amazed that your research isn't getting into the hands of more people. It's such a detailed analysis, and I find that's completely lacking. There's a very strong, simplistic, good versus evil narrative that doesn't anticipate or get into the nuance and complexity of linguistic and regional challenges that you talk about.
I think one reason is that truth is the first casualty of the war, and this has happened in war in Ukraine. So different parties of this conflict, Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and other Western countries, basically started to engage in propaganda and disinformation. This propaganda and disinformation was promoted by governments, Ukrainian, Russian government, and also separatist government in Donbass, but also Western governments. And media, which is supposed to provide more factually based information, actually followed basically what narrative was promoted by the government. So they did not report actually what was on the ground in Ukraine. They did not look into expert opinions, academic experts, but they just promoted narrative which was consistent with what their own governments promoted. And the same applies to Russian media, which is basically controlled by the government, but also Ukrainian media, which also became de facto controlled by Zelensky government and just push such propaganda. But Western media, which was again not controlled by the government, just basically repeated the narrative promoted by their own governments as a part of how to say kind of standard theory of political indexing theory, which says basically that media reporting just reflects narratives which are kind of debates or kind of perspectives which are promoted by political elite. And if there are no challenges, for instance, if there is no political debate and we don't see any political divisions in this issue, for instance, among major political parties in Canada, or again, now with the election of Donald Trump, there are such debates in the US, but in the US also there was basically bipartisan consensus since 2014 until the election of Trump about this conflict. So media just reported kind of such consensus, and they did not challenge anything because this was kind of also beneficial for them to sell this narrative.
Professor, one thing that I wanted to chat with you about has been, you mentioned Zelensky. I haven't been through as many election cycles, but he won with 73% of the vote. Now, I know that there was obviously a lot of Ukraine being divided about being closer to Russia or also being closer to the West and the European Union. I imagine that 73% is an extremely high number for any country, let alone Ukraine. Was there any sense that the majority of the country really supported Zelensky and closer ties with the EU and the West? Because when I read your research and when I read more about Ukraine, I read a heavily divided nation that's struggling. And before, it was a neutral state. It wasn't pro-Russia, it wasn't pro-West. Now it seems to be very much in favor of pro-West. Is it just me, or did that shift happen very quickly, it seems?
No, actually, in Ukrainian elections, almost since independence of Ukraine, elections were very close between pro-Western and pro-Russian candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And this changed with the election of Zelensky. But Zelensky, actually, when he ran for elections and won elections, he ran against Poroshenko, who was main candidate and incumbent president. And Zelensky did not run on platform like a kind of joining NATO. He mentioned this like in some of his platform, which was written somewhere, but it was not major message during his election campaign. He actually ran on platform of ending the war in Ukraine by peaceful negotiations with Russia to end the war in Donbas. Wow. And so he also promised to kind of make Russian language to return to use of Russian language more freely, to lift restrictions on Russian language. And he was Russian speaker, and he was from actually from Eastern Ukraine, or like Kryvyi Rih, which can be also regarded as part of southern Ukraine. So he was a Russian speaker. He did not speak fluent Ukrainian, so he had to learn Ukrainian, how to speak Ukrainian, kind of after he was elected as president. And also his message was against a candidate who was very pro-nationalistic and pro-Western, and because Poroshenko in his presidency basically pursued such policy of joining NATO, made this a central thesis of his campaign, and he even changed constitution from a neutral status of Ukraine, joining NATO and EU as a part of a constitution. Now, this was done by Poroshenko specifically, and he also ran on platform of army, church, and language. So he emphasized that again, reliance on military force to defeat separatists, and he said this was war with Russia, actually claims that this was war with Russia. And he also relied on making Ukrainian language state language, and not just state language, but the only language dominant in Ukraine, basically reducing the use of Russian language in official areas and like in the media. And he also ran on platform of removing influence of Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was historically and religiously linked to Russia. And this is why Zelensky was regarded as opposite from Poroshenko when he was elected. And this is why a lot of people who supported him did not support actually Zelensky, because they regarded basically anybody who would win would be better choice than Poroshenko. So actually in 2019, majority of Ukrainians rejected view of the policy, which now basically is supported by Zelensky, because he changed his policy one kind of into opposite policy basically after he elected, and what I call he became Poroshenko on steroids. So he emphasized all this military, use of military force, rejecting peaceful talks with Russia and with separatists to end the war in Donbas. He resorted to making Ukrainian, use of Ukrainian language by restricting use of Russian language. And he also, supported the creation of Ukrainian, or activity of Ukrainian church, which was created with support of Poroshenko. And he supported restriction on Russian, or this Russian church, Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So this is Zelensky now, and Zelensky, who was elected with support of people, is actually very different candidates and politicians. And this is just this testimony that his mandate when he was elected was not to do this war, and to resort to such policies which are now he pursues, but this actually was opposite. People gave him support for different policies for peaceful resolution of this conflict, and he received absolute majority of support in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. And in western Ukraine, majority of support was received by Poroshenko. But now situation changed, and and now basically Zelensky tries to repeat Poroshenko even more to extreme extent, and this is what often is again not mentioned by the media and others who regard that this is just people all in Ukraine supported Zelensky with such policies from the start, but this was not the case.
Professor, this is what gets me so excited doing conversations like these with you, because you just go all in on the research. But before I get into my next segment, I'd love to know what you think about Zelensky in the Oval Office with the Trump administration. To me, there's a lot of obviously optics there in politics, but as a Ukrainian yourself, you study this very intimately. I'd love to know what you think about what you saw and what you think the future will be for Ukraine under Zelensky.
I think if I can also briefly mention this, I regard Ukrainian politics as more interesting than Hollywood movies. And I tell my students, this is why, for me, studying politics, actually learning about politics in Ukraine, researching politics and conflicts, this is much more interesting than Hollywood movies, because you have such importance and such stakes. And now Zelensky, who was elected as president, he was a comedian, but he was a comedian who was made his name on television, Ukrainian television, and specifically before elections he won to a large extent because he was acting as a president of Ukraine, just playing a role of president of Ukraine in a television series which was shown on a most popular Ukrainian television channel, which was owned by oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, who supported Zelensky. So Zelensky basically won as this actor playing a role of president, and after he was elected he continued basically to play the role of president of Ukraine, and especially after the Russian invasion. So I regard him and his tactics and his behavior in the Oval Office just as a basically play, because he is motivated to get applause, so he plays to the audience. And if he gets applause from the Western, like parliaments, or from the Western politicians, or from Western media, he would play to them. And this is what happened during the office visit, because he had a disagreement with Trump, so he tried to appeal to people, again, just speaking in front of cameras. So he tried to appeal to American media and to Americans who were and Ukrainians who were watching this meeting with Donald Trump. And this backfired very significantly, because Trump did not like this behavior. He also is he also has experience in entertainment industry, so he immediately noticed this, and that's why there was such open conflict. And I think this is also a big issue, because a lot of Zelensky actions are based on his own perception, what will be beneficial for him as in terms of getting publicity, public relations and applause. And so for this reason, he does not care much about Ukraine. He just cares about his own public image and public relations, basically PR image and propaganda image. And for this reason, I think a war which he continues and tries to believes that Ukraine would win the war from the start and so on, is actually based on this image of a new Churchill, basically, which he tries to play, even so this is not his reality. And this is another issue, because a lot of media in the West just presented this as a real Zelensky, but this is not a real Zelensky, because I know what Zelensky was before he started to play this role of a kind of a new Churchill during this war, because he actually refused to draft notice when the war started in Donbas, and he was actually in 2019 he had to go to front line to argue, to try to convince neo-Nazi members from neo-Nazi Azov movement to kind of to basically withdraw the units from front line in Donbas to end the war, basically, or to stop the war there. And basically he was humiliated by these neo-Nazis in television, and this was again just you can just watch how he tried to argue. You have president of Ukraine arguing basically with members of kind of military force, kind of neo-Nazis, and he tried to convince them to withdraw their forces. He could not even order them to do this because he was afraid that they could do something against him or try to overthrow him, as was done with Yanukovych, or try to kind of threaten him. So he, for this reason, so he basically tried. He was not very tough, and he was regarded as weak president. And I still regard him as weak president of Ukraine because he just gave this image of tough kind of politician, but actually he's not the one. He just plays such a politician. I think this is very disastrous, basically, to play such a person for his benefit, for just applause, but with very disastrous consequences for Ukraine, because this is reality, and reality just cannot be just played over tennis. You can have this happy end as you would typically have in Hollywood movie.
Professor, some argue that the reason why Zelensky had so much popularity was because of the Maidan protests, also known as Euromaidan, which is a series of mass demonstrations that happened in Kiev in November 2013 and continued into February 2014. They were pro-European, pro-democracy, but evolved into a larger movement that led to major political change. Now, do you buy that? Because to me, I find that is a very simplified version of understanding the rise to power for Zelensky.
No, actually, this is like kind of this propaganda image which has nothing to do with reality, because Zelensky actually ran in supporting Yanukovych in 2014 elections. So he supported Yanukovych when he was a part of this comedy group, which was popular in Ukraine. So he supported actually Yanukovych in elections for president of Ukraine in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, when kind of election results were cancelled and you have new round of elections, and there are like images, photos of basically Zelensky and his other members of his comedy group, Quartal 95, were running in support of kind of just making kind of shows in support of election of Yanukovych in different locations of Ukraine. And during Maidan, actually Zelensky did not support Maidan. He did not support Maidan. He was again giving a television kind of this comedy television sketches and performances on Ukrainian television. And in one performance, he basically kind of even even mocked Maidan protesters basically for their clashes with police. So this is an only kind of after he again was elected as a president of Ukraine, kind of he now reveals all this Maidan and so on. Even so, during Maidan, he was not active at all, and he actually did not even support Maidan publicly. And this is, I think, very common for Ukrainian politicians, because when I was a student in Ukraine, in Kiev, in 1980s, second part of this, I attended the first opposition demonstration, which was held in Kiev in, I think, since for more than 70 years, basically since independence not only since independence, no, this before actually independence of Ukraine. This was in Soviet Ukraine. So this demonstration was held for the first time in 1988, since Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War. And at the time, this demonstration was attended just a few dozen people, other people. And this was very dangerous because people were arrested during this demonstration. For one, I remember one woman was arrested by plainclothes, like I think KGB officers, for trying to unveil Ukrainian flag, and so on. And this is just illustration of this, because at the time, at that very time, like people like Poroshenko and other Ukrainian leaders of Ukraine, modern leaders of Ukraine, actually during Poroshenko, they were actually members of the Soviet elite. They did not support such demonstrations. They actually made very good kind of they had very good positions, or kind of Poroshenko was studied at Kyiv International Economic Relations Department, which required approval and references from regional party committee. So he was member of Soviet elite, and he did not support any of such demonstrations. And many politicians then supported basically Soviet Communist Party, and they did not support independence of Ukraine. But they changed their view overnight after the collapse of Soviet Union and declaration of independence of Ukraine. They became overnight supporters of Ukrainian independence and so on. And the same happened with Zelensky. Basically, he changed his view again and again by playing this role of now pro-Western politician and so on, a supporter of Maidan and so on, and Ukrainian language and so on, and church and so, and presenting himself as Democrat and relying on military force, like tough military leader and political leader. Even so, this is not his reality. So he just changes his political views as it would be beneficial for him, as many other Ukrainian politicians do.
Chameleon. Professor, you've written a lot about the massacre, and I want to get to that right now. So for those that are not aware, there was the Maidan sniper massacre on February 20th. It's one of the most pivotal moments at the time, the Euromaidan uprising. In the morning, snipers began shooting the crowds of protesters in Kiev. Between 40 to 50 protesters were killed in just a few hours. Most were shot in the head, neck, and heart. The official narrative was that this was the pro-Yanukovych forces opening fire on protesters in an attempt to suppress the revolution by force. This forced Yanukovych to fly from Kiev and be removed from office, and the rapid installation of a pro-Western interim government. In your work, Professor, The Snipers Massacre on Maidan in Ukraine, you present a meticulous, detailed analysis challenging the official version. Specifically, Professor, you talk about the dozens of videos and radio intercepts showing that many of the protesters were shot from buildings controlled by the protest movement. Some footage even shows snipers exiting protester-controlled buildings. So this is interesting, Professor. I want to dig into this some more. What was some of your findings pointing to in terms of what was the point of these snipers if they were from protest-controlled buildings?
Yes, I think this is one of the most crucial issues in terms of origins of the current conflict and Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I researched Maidan Massacre since it was happening live. I was watching this live when it happened in Canada, again, because of time difference. So I researched this since looking into all publicly available evidence, including the evidence which was revealed by the Maidan Massacre trial investigation, which was broadcast. We have trial sessions which were broadcast online on YouTube. So I was watching them, analyzing about 1,000 hours of television footage from Maidan Massacre trial, and also analyzing now almost 1 million word text of the verdict from this trial. And I already published one book which was published last year, which is open access, freely available for anybody who wants to read online. There are already almost 400,000 views and downloads of this book. It's chapters online, just on publisher website.
And what's the title of that, Professor?
Sorry?
What's the title of that book?
This title of the book is the Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, the mass killing which changed the world.
Okay. I'll leave a link in the description for everyone.
Yeah, it's published by Palgrave Macmillan, and I published this as open access, which freely available. And I also publish now, including forthcoming article, I have now 4 peer-reviewed journal articles on this Maidan Massacre and 1 book chapter. And I have also recently presented a conference paper at the International Studies Association annual conference in Chicago about the Maidan Massacre trial verdict. So I studied this extensively, very extensively. So I can say, based on all evidence, which is just overwhelming evidence which I examined, all this evidence shows that there were Maidan snipers, including snipers who were linked to far-right organizations, in the Hotel Ukraina, and about 20 other buildings which were controlled by the Maidan opposition. And Hotel Ukraina was controlled by the far-right Svoboda party. They admitted this in their official statement that they took Hotel Ukraina under their control and got before the Maidan massacre. And they controlled this during the massacre. You have videos and photos of deputies from this party controlling this hotel entrance and exit. They also basically had apartments. They had rooms there. Many of the deputies from Svoboda live in the Hotel Ukraina, and I stay in this hotel myself when I visited Kiev. So I stay for maybe like 1 dozen times myself. So I know very well location where the massacre took place, and including Hotel Ukraina, I stay there many times. So and I can say based on this analysis, just based on videos, there are like videos, more than 14 videos of Maidan snipers in different Maidan control locations, shooting with different kind of weapons, hunting weapons, or from Kalashnikov type of weapons into direction of police and Maidan protesters, Maidan activists, including from Hotel Ukraina. There are also videos of these snipers who can be identified by name. They were led by a leader of this group who was later elected as a member of Ukrainian Parliament, who was linked to the right sector, which is far right organization, which was very important during the Maidan. And so they were in the Hotel Ukraina during the Maidan massacre. And so you have basically videos of the sniper shooting into the direction of Maidan activists. The snipers were in the Hotel Ukraina, and they were also shooting. There are videos of them shooting from the Hotel Ukraina room, which was occupied by one of the leaders of this far right Svoboda party, into British BBC television journalists. There are such videos by BBC which were posted online, and also I included in my studies. They were also shooting from the same window, from the same hotel room of Svoboda deputy into Maidan activists. This Ukrainian television video which shows them doing this, and journalists reported this during the Maidan massacre. You have other like videos, including video which was filmed by Belgian television, which shows that protesters were shot from the back from the Hotel Ukraina, and they noticed this, and they would turn back and asking snipers in the hotel not to shoot at them. And this actually footage also shows by Belgian television, shows how these protesters were led to the Maidan massacre site by other Maidan activists who led them for no reason. And they did not want to go. They testified that they don't want to go, and you can see in this footage that they did not want to go because they already knew that there were snipers in Hotel Ukraina, but they were led by Maidan activists basically for this area where they were shot, and most of them were killed or wounded. And majority of wounded Maidan activists testified during the Maidan massacre trial that they were shot not by the police in front of them or any snipers in front of them in government controlled locations, but they said they were shot by snipers in the Hotel Ukraina and other Maidan controlled buildings and areas, which is just quite unbelievable because you have people who were wounded, who were Maidan activists, and they testified contrary to their interest, but they testified during the investigation, and also many of them testified during the trial that they were shot by such snipers in Maidan control Hotel Ukraina, or that they saw snipers in these locations. And this was denied by official investigation. Official investigation said there were no such snipers in Hotel Ukraina at all. Even so, you have videos, you have such testimonies, even by majority of wounded Maidan activists. And I also found several hundred other witness testimonies, including about 100 witness testimonies during the Maidan massacre trial about such snipers located in these buildings, about involvement of Maidan snipers in this massacre. Also, there are admissions, public admissions in different media interviews, and even testimony to the Maidan massacre trial by 14 members of Maidan sniper groups that they shot police. Some of them testified, also Georgian snipers also testified that they also shot Maidan activists as well, or that they received order to shoot from Maidan leaders to shoot both Maidan activists and police. And this is supported not just by videos, supported by testimonies, witnesses, and wounded Maidan activists, but also supported by forensic evidence. Because forensic evidence, forensic ballistic examinations found that many Maidan activists were shot from Hotel Ukraina and other Maidan control locations. And for this reason, official investigation did not conduct forensic ballistic examinations in most cases. They only conducted in few cases, and even after they were ordered to do this by Maidan Massacre trial court in Ukraine, for the trial to do this officially, they did not conduct this. And lawyers testified that they basically stopped such ballistic examinations after first such examinations showed that the protesters were killed from Hotel Ukraina, again, which obviously was contrary to what they stated publicly. Prosecution denies that there were any snipers. So this is also supported by forensic medical examinations, which shows that almost all Maidan activists were shot, killed, and wounded from very steep directions, from the side and from the back. Even when they saw police, when they faced police in front of them on the same ground level. And this also official investigation in my research also found that government snipers arrived to the area and they were not responsible for the massacre because they already arrived at the time when a massacre was almost over. And actually massacre stopped basically, with some exceptions, shooting of Maidan activists stopped after arrival of government snipers in government controlled buildings. But these snipers arrived afterwards, after almost all Maidan activists were killed and wounded. So this is just evidence which is just unbelievable. In even Maidan Massacre trial verdict, which was issued after several years of trial, stated publicly that in the text of this trial verdict, they stated that there were snipers in Hotel Ukraina, that they were shooting of these snipers, that they shot many and wounded, killed and many Maidan activists from the Hotel Ukraina and other Maidan control locations. And they also testified that this hotel, verdict stated explicitly that this hotel was controlled by Maidan activists during the Maidan massacre. And they also said that Maidan's basic activists shot at the BBC television crew, which was filmed by BBC television. So this is all official, all stated in the verdict. But there was total blackout of this verdict text in the media. No major Western media, with a few exceptions, reported this just after I published this on social media. So just my evidence was reported, but recently there was a Hill article based on my research, but the verdict basically was totally ignored and suppressed. Even so, Ukrainian trial had to admit that such snipers existed in the Hotel Ukraina, that this hotel was controlled by Maidan opposition, by Maidan activists, and that many activists were killed and wounded from this hotel. And this was all officially denied by the media. This was regarded as conspiracy theory and so on. Even so, I showed this in my studies, that all this evidence was already publicly available. And Maidan Massacre trial verdict also stated officially that there was no evidence that Yanukovych, then President Yanukovych, or any members of his government issued any order to massacre Maidan activists. And this was very crucial because Yanukovych was blamed for this massacre immediately by Biden, by Western politicians, by Western media, Ukrainian media, and Maidan opposition. And so he basically was overthrown by being falsely blamed for this massacre, and he fled Ukraine because of he was falsely blamed for Maidan massacre, and also because of there were also assassination attempts against him as a part of this Maidan massacre. So this is just unbelievable that even Western media would not report this. Even so, I published this on social media, and I published even text of this verdict, which referred to such evidence of snipers in Maidan control Hotel Ukraina, and that they shot Maidan activists. But again, this was suppressed by mainstream media with just a few notable exceptions.
Professor, I have just a few minutes with you left. I want to say a few things. First, thank you for your public service. Putting your book out free of charge with over 400,000 downloads tells us that your research is so needed, and it's so refreshing to see people like yourself and meet people like yourself that against all odds, and I'm sure you've had your peers criticize you, for doing this work, and yet you persevere on. So thank you. Seriously, this is incredible. I know so many families in Ukraine are probably benefiting from knowing that voices like yours exist and you're willing to look at things objectively. For those that are less aware, there's at least 14 videos showing snipers in Maidan-controlled buildings aiming or shooting at protesters, contradicting the widespread belief that government forces alone were responsible for the massacre. 2019 forensic bullet examination, to the professor's point, showed that bullets from Berkut Kalashnikovs did not match those extracted from killed protesters. Contradicts the prosecution's narrative. And what's also very interesting, 14 individuals admitted to being Maidan snipers. These confessions are largely ignored in Western media and in government narratives. Now, Professor, before we wrap this up, because there's so much to unpack with your research, Professor, I wanted to ask you this, because often we talk about Ukraine, or often media talks about Ukraine and NATO. And after reading your articles and now reading little bits of your book, and I'll leave that link below, how can we talk about this without talking about the Maidan Massacre and the moral corruption and corrupting of Ukraine? Could their NATO membership ever be reevaluated given that the changing view on the massacre could happen? What are your thoughts about that?
I have an entire book which would be published this summer, which looks into role of escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, which started with Maidan Massacre. So
Wow.
I examined all the conflicts which followed the Maidan Massacre, and I can say that based on my research, entire book, which argues that the Maidan Massacre led to overthrow of Yanukovych and led to Russia responded with annexation of Russian Crimea, and there was also start of civil war and Russian military interventions in Donbas, and that this led, basically, Maidan Massacre led to conflicts in Ukraine, but also to conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, and these conflicts escalated with Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was illegal under international law, but it was not unprovoked, as was this kind of propaganda image in the West. So that's why it's very important to understand this massacre and to actually know what happened during the Maidan massacre. And this is another reason why I conduct such research. So that's why I think this is a crucial issue to do this. And in terms of NATO membership, which is I think also NATO membership was a real issue, and Russia justified the invasion of Ukraine by NATO membership of Ukraine or possibility of NATO membership of Ukraine. But based on my research, there was no real possibility of such NATO membership. And actually, since Maidan, actually, I regard Ukraine as basically becoming client state of the United States. And Ukraine basically lost its sovereignty because Western governments de facto supported violent overthrow of Yanukovych government by means of the Maidan massacre, and they used Ukraine as a client state specifically to weaken Russia for geopolitical reasons. This had nothing to do with democracy. This was actually opposite to democracy and human rights and rule of law, but it was supported by the Western governments because Ukraine was very useful to weaken Russia or contain Russia. And during the war with Russia, Ukraine was used as a proxy, again, to weaken Russia or to contain Russia, but without any possibility of defeating Russia. And Ukraine was instead promised NATO membership, even so there was no such real possibility. So now I think this is recognized even by Trump, who said openly that Ukraine would never join NATO. And I said this from the start of the war, that there was no such possibility of Ukraine becoming a NATO member. And I think this kind of conflict could have been prevented. This war could have been prevented or avoided or stopped much earlier if people would have recognized how this was started and actually what was the real situation, not this kind of fairy tale image which was promoted by the media and by politicians about Ukraine, which I regard as as a basic Hollywood version of Ukraine, which has nothing to do with reality.
Professor, before I let you go, your research is peer-reviewed. Your research has been out there. You've written numerous articles and books. I'll leave links below. And yet I find your research does not get picked up by enough people. Why do you think that is? What I gather is people who take your perspective, they're often labeled as pro-Russia or very critical of the West, but you're truly objective in your analysis. I must say, you're not trying to push a narrative. At least that's how I interpret it. Why do you think more people aren't reading your work?
Yes, exactly. This is like my research is based on evidence, not on any kind of political motivations. Myself, I supported European Union membership of Ukraine before the Maidan, after the Maidan, and during the Maidan, and I still support European Union membership of Ukraine. So I have nothing to do with Russia, but so again, I rely on evidence as any scholar supposed to do, and this is, I think, what my motivation was. I mentioned to find actually what happened in reality, not what would be told by politicians and by the media. And in terms of reaction, I think a lot of people deny this and or are afraid to admit actually what happened during the Maidan, because all their narrative, all their views are based on this image, which is found. So Maidan and Maidan massacre is founding myth of Ukraine, which never existed. So if they would admit that they were basically fooled into believing that this was popular protest, peaceful protest, led by politicians and by Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians who wanted to make Ukraine as a new Western country, or kind of join Western countries. They were peaceful and supported and opposed this dictator and so on, Russian Yanukovych and so on. This is kind of narrative would just fall apart, and this would mean that all this subsequent conflicts also need to be evaluated and look into in more complex way, as I do in my research. And they do not want to do this because for them this is, I think, very easy to rely on this kind of, again, Hollywood version of good versus evil and so on, in which there is no need to learn about all these aspects, just follow what is told, and especially if you have all this evidence, such evidence which is presented in my studies, they try to ignore this evidence or rely on false claims, just trying to deny this, or just making all the stuff about me or my research and so on. Even so, again, my now studies are now supported by and cited not only by many scholars, but also de facto supported by even Maidan Massacre trial verdict, which is very important official admission in Ukraine in this situation. And I think there will be even more evidence very soon about what actually happened during the Maidan. I think for me this is just a consideration which not the major consideration. I'm not motivated by any publicity or any kind of attempt to get any kind of personal benefit. I regard the basic mission of a scholar as as basically telling the truth at a very difficult time, and I did this from the very start when I was an undergraduate student in Kiev, in Soviet Ukraine, in the end of in 1990. I submitted my undergraduate thesis to my advisor, and my advisor said that he would not be my advisor. He could not be my advisor because what I submitted in my undergraduate thesis was not acceptable. So he said I need to talk to my head of my department, who told me that I would be expelled from university for writing my undergraduate thesis. Wow. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis in Ukrainian, but they said this is not a problem. You can write in Chinese. They said this is not a problem. But they said the problem was that I wrote my thesis using Western economic theories and theories of Max Weber, wow, who was classical German sociologist, political sociologist. They said this is not acceptable, and so they they threatened me with expulsion from university, and I wrote this anyway. And because I wrote this thesis, there were some political changes in Ukraine at that time because of Gorbachev, perestroika, and glasnost. So I was not expelled from university, but I could not go to graduate school then. So I could not go to graduate school. I had to do other work on rehabilitation of people who were expelled to Siberia from Ukraine. But only with collapse of the Soviet Union, I was able to go to graduate school in the West. So this is for me nothing. I always regard the mission of a scholar basically as telling the truth, even so when it was very dangerous, and it was much more dangerous in the Soviet Union than it is now. So that's why I for me integrity and academic integrity is very important. Even so, this is now very difficult to do because a lot of even academics took a very easy way in which they just repeat all these narratives promoted by politicians and the media, and abandon their mission and their duty basically to tell actually what was going on and what was what is just this narrative which is basically based on this on false information. And this is, I think, not easy task, because after I did my first presentations and my first conference presentation about Maidan Massacre in 2014, my house and all other property in Ukraine were seized by decisions, by fabricated decisions from the court, under directives from the top, from politicians who were involved in this massacre or linked to Maidan snipers. So for me, this is again but I still not intimidated, and I regard this duty as a scholar. And I published for this reason my book as open access, which is available, and I still crowdfunding, and because I got support from a lot of people who we are crowdfunding to publish this book open access, and I would also publish open access my new book about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins, which also goes back to Maidan and overthrow of Yanukovych. So this is, I think, a very important issue, and I hope this book would also attract a lot of attention and would help to resolve this conflict. in Ukraine, which is very devastating conflict to Ukrainians, and also kind of has very important consequences to people in other countries, including Canada and the United States and many other countries, in addition to Ukraine and Ukrainians.
Professor, you've given me so much of your time, well more than I asked for. So I want to say thank you again. I've said thank you before, but I want to say thank you again for your public service. I mean, making these things free and open on such an important topic. So often today, as you know, everything's hidden by paywalls and forces people to pay money. And you are doing the research, having it peer reviewed, and saying, I want every single person to read this free of charge. And that's truly incredible, Professor. So thank you. And it seems like from your undergrad to now, you're very accustomed to people coming at your work and critiquing it, critiquing your using Max Weber of all people, the ability for you to defend yourself, I mean, under such circumstances is incredible. So again, thank you for your work, Professor. I want this conversation to continue, so let's definitely keep in touch. I want us to do another podcast about your book this summer. I want us to go into more detail about Ukraine and NATO. I want us to also go into a lot more detail, and I think you might have a very unique perspective on Canada and Ukraine, because unlike other G7 nations, I think Canada probably stands at the top when it comes to support for Ukraine, which is quite interesting because I went down a deep rabbit hole of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, and I found all our political leaders speaking at the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. And I found that to be interesting because we should have open and honest discussions about our support for Ukraine. And it just does not seem that to be the case from any political leader. And something that I've encouraged my friends on the left to post to the liberals, my friends on the right to post to conservatives. Hey, what's our stance on Ukraine? And what's interesting is everyone's like, oh, we should continue to support them. And I say, wait a minute. Everyone's singing from the same songbook. That's a red flag to me. We're divided on a lot of things in Canada, but we're united on Ukraine. It seems very odd, but I would love to chat more about that and what you see as some of the influence in Canada too.
Yes, thank you again for great questions, and thank you again for for appreciation of my research. And I can briefly mention like Canadian connection, that research is also very important about which had an impact in Canada when there was this SS Galicia veteran given state innovation in the Canadian Parliament. I did research about this division because actually one of the units which later joined this division under Nazis was based in my high school in Western Ukraine. So I published peer-reviewed journal articles, and then after this person was given standing ovation, I saw references to him as basically a Ukrainian-Canadian hero, which was mentioned by Speaker of Ukrainian Parliament, Canadian Parliament, and then Zelensky was given also standing ovation to him. And actually, I immediately knew that this person was from actually SS Galicia division because he was mentioned as a member of first Ukrainian National Division. And so I published this on Twitter, and this led to basically became viral tweet and led to a lot of media interviews. And finally, as a result of this my research basically and contribution of many other people, this actually led to resignation of Canadian Speaker from his position, and also to apology from the Prime Minister of Canada. But there are other people like Zelensky and other people who were involved in this debacle who basically stayed silent about this issue. Mm-hmm. Even so, it was very clear-cut issue, basically Nazi SS division veteran given standing ovation. So I think even then you have many people who just decided not to express their views or were hidden their views. But this is, I think, also important connection to not only in Ukrainian politics but also Canadian politics because of what happened with this epic debacle in the Canadian Parliament.
Very interesting, Professor. Thank you again for your time. This is so interesting. I'm so excited to read more of your work. Everyone, I'll leave links below to Professor Katchanovski's work, including his free book. And as well, we will connect again, Professor, on more research on this topic. I think this is so fascinating.
Thank you.